Chapter 15. A right for a woman giving birth without a husband. The Vedras civilization, Vladimir, had a great many rights. The word right is not entirely appropriate for such acts, but I simply cannot think of an alternative. Let us use it for the sake of brevity. Only you must understand that in today's language, the Vedras right could easily be termed a scientific and rational act on the part of man, one grounded in knowledge of all the diverse energies of the universe and their interrelationship with man's soul. These rites, as you know, were thought out by generations of wise men and enlightened thinkers, who also connected them with the stars. Subsequent generations checked their effectiveness in practice and perfected them as the years went by. One of these rites was for women who were carrying and giving birth to a child far from their husbands. Such situations did exist in the Vedras civilization, albeit rarely. It might happen that a woman's husband was obliged to go on a long trek somewhere. His pregnant wife, left at home, carried out an outwardly simple rite, but one which lasted a long time and was very complex in terms of the mind and will. If the woman's love for the child's father was strong, she achieved her goal on her own and bore a fully fledged child. She was assisted in this by the great energy of love. What actions did this rite involve specifically? In our modern-day society, there are also women who are obliged to carry a child and then give birth without the husbands around. Maybe the rite you speak of would apply to them. Over the 9-month period, a pregnant woman whose husband is absent should spend at least 3 hours a day communicating with her child in the father's name, sometimes also conversing mentally with the father about the future child. They might argue, but under no circumstances should they allow any suggestion of aggression to enter in, even during an argument. The parents' dialogue should always proceed in a spirit of good will, both toward each other and toward the child. The dialogue should preferably take place at the same time each day. The woman's communication with the child in the father's name may be divided into 2 segments, evening and morning. Approximately 15 to 19 minutes before engaging in this kind of mental dialogue, the woman should definitely take a small amount of easily digestible food or drink, which will be healthful both to her and to the child. The drink taken in preparation for the mental dialogue should not vary over the course of the 9 months, and should not be used in any other circumstances for any other purpose. I, for example, prepared a drink consisting of about 100 grams of cedar milk, 3 drops of cedar oil, and a pinch of pollen. I also took a little honey on a twig, mixed everything together in a wooden bowl, and drank it in tiny swallows. The drink could also be made from other substances, only they must definitely be natural, ecologically clean, and easily digestible by the mother's body, as well as healthful and pleasing to the child in the womb. This is very important. If the mother's drink is not healthful or pleasing to the child, he will associate the dialogue with his father with an unpleasant phenomenon and afterward reject his father and resist communicating with him. After the birth of the child, the woman should take the same drink shortly before a feeding, at which time she plans to communicate with her nursling in the father's name. If the father does not return by the time the child ceases to take his mother's milk, the mother's drink should never be given to the child until the moment of his first contact with his father. The woman also needs to choose a star in the heavens through which to communicate with her beloved man, a star to think upon each time before initiating a mental dialogue with her child. In this mental communication, the woman should formulate as distinctly as possible a thought picture of the child's father, his character, intonations, and worldview, without falsification or embellishing any details. If she has a difference of opinion with him, she should try to explain her point of view, not aggressively but lovingly. Instead of blaming the man for the misunderstanding, She should point the finger to herself as incapable of setting forth thoughts understandably and convincingly. Or possibly she should think more carefully about what her husband has said. In addition, during her dialogue, the pregnant woman should stroke her tummy while cherishing an image of the father in her thought. And it is very important, while conversing mentally with her husband, to rule out all negative aspects that might have occurred earlier. It is vital to remember only the good while communicating with him. The woman should spend as much as possible of the 9-month period in real solitude. When the child will feel both her and his father, and if the husband and father is not physically present, the child will still find himself in his father's aura. If the woman carries out the aspects of this rite, the man will come back to her and to their child. Even if earlier his love was weak or was not there, love will flare up in him with unaccustomed strength and provoke him to good deeds. Many Vedras women knew the effectiveness and power of this. Later, the wise men tried to erase it from women's memories and turned to it when they were confident that the woman was not harbouring any perverse feelings. Perverse feelings, Anastasia. A woman in love could, through the help of this rite, seduce a man who was not in love with her, even if he were living with another wife, and even if they had not had intimate relations. But how could it happen if they had not had intimacy? Without intimacy, a child could not have been conceived at all, and in that case, who could she talk to about a father? No matter what man she conceived with, she might try communicating with her child in the name of her most beloved, thereby drawing this man closer to herself. Not only that, but the child will even outwardly bear a greater resemblance to her most beloved, rather than the man who was actually with her. You should know that, Vladimir, from the phenomenon of telegony. Yes, I know, Anastasia, but why are you giving out this information that the wise men suppressed? Now some women will start luring men they fancy away from their families with the help of this rite. It shouldn't be published. You needn't be concerned about publishing it, Vladimir. I purposely left one particular aspect out of my description. Now it will not destroy any happy families. But if you were able to leave out some aspect, why didn't the wise men do the same? The wise men did not know what to put in its place. If the wise men didn't know, how could you possibly know? Besides, Anastasia, you said that the wise men always check the effectiveness of their rites in practice, but you didn't have the opportunity to do that. I did. When? With whom? Oh God, I remembered Anastasia's words from many years ago. I didn't pay any attention to them back then, but now, she said, I shall restore to you the respect of your daughter and the love of your wife. It's incredible, but she did it. But why then is my wife not jealous of Anastasia? And why does my daughter have so much respect for her? I went back to see my family this year. Anastasia was able to perform the miracle, the incredible. I don't know how she did it, but she did it. All our earthly institutions taken together, institutions that pride themselves on their technological achievements, are incapable of solving the number one problem on the earth: how to restore love and respect to families. But she can. Oh Lord, what colossal, truly divine knowledge mankind is losing. Why? Who can give an answer? And what strength of love Anastasia herself is worthy of. What she has accomplished will probably be appreciated more by our descendants than by people today. I felt like doing something very nice for her. I went over to Anastasia, got down on one knee and kissed her hand. She also got down on her knees and embraced my neck. I heard her heart beating and sensed the extraordinary aroma of her hair, her intoxicating breath, the fragrance of mother's milk as though it was coming from my own mother's breast. And I whispered, "What can I do to be worthy of you, Anastasia?" But she didn't answer, only pressed my head a little bit more strongly to her breast. My life has probably never been blessed with happier seconds, hours, or days than these. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16. Where should we have our babies? How hard it is to write in a dry style, and yet it is absolutely necessary to determine, without agitation or emotion, where the best and most comfortable place is for parents and infants to go through the birthing process, in a hospital operation room or a home setting. As far as I know, the first maternity homes appeared during the period of slavery in ancient Egypt and Rome, where they were organised for pregnant slaves. A birthing slave mother stayed from 5 to 9 days with her baby before returning to work. She was allowed access to her child for nursing and at night time. This continued from 6 to 12 months. It was different in different places, depending on how the slave masters treated their slaves. After being weaned from its mother, the child was taken care of by specially trained slave nurses. Later, when the child had grown, he would go off to be raised by other slaves, depending on the function designated for him by the overlord. For example, boys might be handed over to specialists to be trained as warriors. After going through these special physical training and psychological conditioning, these warriors, who knew not their parents, proved to be the most loyal to their slave master. They were brainwashed from childhood to consider him as father and mother. In short, God. There was even a religion worked out specifically, especially for the purpose of this brainwashing. How close seems this situation from antiquity to our reality today? Maternity home, nursery, kindergarten, school, college, and presto, the slave is ready. But since the slave master is invisible, the slave thinks he's free and consequently will not rebel. The elite of ancient Rome and Egypt, and even their middle classes, couldn't begin to imagine, even in their wildest nightmares, the birth of their own children outside the home. They would first call in midwives, later doctors and soothsayers. In Russia, the first huts for birthing mothers were designated for prostitutes. Sometimes this category of woman went off to give birth in a gypsy camp, where they would leave their unwanted children to be raised by the gypsies. The gypsies accepted them. A maternity home or a maternity ward in a hospital is utter nonsense. It is clear testimony to the loss of women's instinct to continue the family line, as well as to modern man's ignorance, not only of his pristine origins, but even of the fundamental culture of feelings, his loss of feelings of true love for his wife and child as being part of himself and his legacy. A child born in an institution cannot be exclusively yours. He belongs to someone else besides. The birthing process includes conception, carrying to term, and the appearance of the infant in the world. And the last stage is no less significant than the rest. If you hand him over to strangers who are completely indifferent to both you and your offspring, then you have less than a full relationship to the birth. Consequently, you will not have fatherly feelings for him in full measure, and he will feel this and afterward requite it with an absence of strong filial feelings towards you. More than that, the love will not be what it could. Such a child could not be able to love, not just his parents, but life itself, since life was never, right from the moment of his appearance in the world, presented to him as something attractive. Of course, this lacuna can be compensated for by means of certain behaviour toward the newborn, but that is by no means easy. The birthing of children among different peoples of the world can be considered more and more perfect the farther we go back in history, and primitive in the absurd today. In our modern world, it has become tantamount to removing the appendix from the body of a sick person. And so I should now like to switch to a brighter note. In spite of everything, mankind is beginning to ponder the meaning of what has been happening. In Russia, America, and France, so-called schools of spiritual midwifery have sprung up. There is also an organisation known as the Association for Prenatal Education, active in a number of countries. Courses in home births are being offered in Moscow and St. Petersburg. People are trying to bring back the knowledge and traditions they have lost, the love they have lost. Let us see how the birthing process took place in Vedras families. According to Anastasia's account, it went as follows. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17. The Vedras birth. The birthing mother's mama and grandma would tell her what symptoms to expect on the eve of her labour. Lubamila's grandmother, in this instance, told her in detail how she gave birth to her own children. Vedras women, as a rule, gave birth in their own homes, in a wooden tub, something like our bathtub, only shorter in length and not as deep. It was a container designed especially for childbirth. Afterward, it served as a cradle for the newborn. To start, it was filled with pure spring water, heated to body temperature. There were 2 little ledges on the outside of the tub which served as footrests. The edges of the tub were curved so that it was easy for the woman to support herself with her hands. The air temperature in the room was not measured with a thermometer back then. They said it should feel comfortable for a naked body in a state of repose, with no sensation of either heat or cold. The tub for birthing mothers was placed on the floor and oriented so that the woman sitting in it would be facing toward the rising sun. Another smaller container of water was placed beside it. On the bench next to the tub lay 4 plain, smooth textured flaxen towels without embroidery or designs. During the Vedras birth, only the husband was to be present in the room with the birthing mother. Even the couple's parents and close relatives, as well as experienced midwives, were excluded. Just before labour began, the child's father would light a fire he had already prepared in the outer entrance of the domain, from which wafted sweet-smelling smoke. This was where the close relatives usually gathered, along with the midwife and often a wise man. The birthing mothers and her parents and her husband's parents would bring in bundles and baskets of food and drink. They would sit down on benches under a tree, under a tent roof which had been set up earlier next to the fire pit by the husband. Vedras tradition forbade them from crossing the line into the domain, nor was the birthing mother's husband permitted to go out to them, or even to talk with them at a distance. Such rules were not the product of some kind of superstition, but the result of finely tuned psychological calculations. Nobody and nothing was supposed to distract the thought of the father, let alone the birthing mother, from the reception of their child. The presence of the parents and midwife at the entrance of the domain, however, had a calming effect on the young parents-to-be. In case any abnormalities cropped up, they could always come in to help. But there was rarely a need for such assistance. During the contractions, the mother would constantly talk with her emerging child, giving him words of encouragement, helping him enter upon his new world without fear. The Vedras people well knew how important it was to communicate both mentally and audibly with the new man as he emerged into the world. As a result, all 3, mother, child and father, were participants in the process. It was also very important that the mother's first look at her newborn be without any fright at his appearance, a temporary stubbed nose, for example, or the birth colour of his skin, that her gaze be tender and joyous. The father would pick up the baby out of the water he had been born in, use his own mouth right off to suck the mucus out of his little mouth and nose, and place him on his mother's tummy. The mother would then offer the baby her breast. This prompted the expulsion of the placenta, which the father placed in a specially prepared container. Before cutting the umbilical cord with a knife which had been disinfected over a flame and tying it. Then the father took the baby and placed him on a towel. After washing him, he wrapped him up in a second towel and placed him on the bed. Then he washed his wife's body using water from the other container next to the tub, dried her off with a clean towel, and led her over to the bed where the baby lay. Next, the father, using either his mouth or his hands, strained off a small quantity of milk from the mother's breast and sprayed it over a flaxen sheet, with which he covered the new mother and the infant lying on her tummy or breast. After that, the father sat down and gazed silently at his wife. If she desired, he would talk with her, or even if she were asleep, he would not leave the room. About 15 minutes later, he would light the wood fire he had earlier prepared in the hearth. He would then pour out the birthing water, as well as the water the woman had used to wash herself, between the two trees, which had been planted soon after conception. Here, too, was where the placenta would be buried. The relatives that had gathered at the entrance of the domain would see the smoke from the chimney and understand this, along with the father's actions, to signal that the birth had taken place successfully. At this point, they began exchanging congratulations and partaking of the food and drink they had brought with them, after which they dispersed to their homes. The Vedras people understood that even in the womb, the child could sense relatives' thoughts and feelings, and after coming into the world, he would continue to find himself in his parents' aura. If some kind of outsiders, even a relative with good thoughts about the child, happened to be in the birthing room, their feelings, even good ones, would be unfamiliar to the child and put him on the defensive. Besides, either deliberately or inadvertently, the relatives might distract the parents' thought from the infant. It was in the parents' mental field, after all, that the baby would feel the most comfortable. A little experiment should help prove what Anastasia has said here. Many women are aware that during breastfeeding they should not allow themselves to be distracted by random conversations and thoughts, especially on negative topics. They are concentrating their whole attention on their child, on his feeding, and mentally conversing with him. For evidence that the baby really does feel the mother's thought, try entering the room where a mother is nursing her baby and strike up a conversation with her. The baby will at once feel uneasy and may even stop his sucking and start to cry. He has become uncomfortable, and his mama's thoughts about him have weakened and have wandered off somewhere. But perhaps the baby was simply disturbed by the stranger's voice or odour. I telephoned my daughter Polina. She picked up the receiver and started talking with me. 30 seconds into the conversation, I heard the cry of my granddaughter, Mashenka. "Why is she crying?" I asked my daughter. "I'm breastfeeding her, Papa," Polina responded. "She doesn't like it when I'm distracted." I tried to end the conversation quickly. I did the same whenever I rang at an inopportune moment. My granddaughter would always start crying. Many nursing mothers who are familiar with the culture of breastfeeding will confirm this phenomenon. But it does not happen as a rule with children of mothers who are unaware of the importance of mental contact with their nursling, who chat away at feeding time with all and sundry, or spend the time thinking about their own problems. Why not? Because their child has no concept of mental contact with his mother. It is something he never had, and so has no point of comparison. There's an old saying, he took it in with his mother's milk. What are our babies today taking in with their mother's milk? Human society has learned to create all sorts of satellites and intercontinental ballistic missiles, yet at the same time it has lost something more important: the culture of giving birth to and raising man. As a result, people end up aiming these missiles at each other. Now, what possible connection could there be between the culture of prenatal education, the breastfeeding of children, and wars? A most direct connection indeed. Many still remember the accounts of the Rostov serial killer, Chikatilo. He performed sadistic acts on young women and then killed them. Such maniacs have appeared in many other cities, terrorizing the populace. Each time, hundreds of policemen are dispatched to hunt down and capture the killer. But an interesting pattern emerges from this. It has been established that in the case of 3 Rostov maniacs at least, their mothers had all made unsuccessful attempts to abort their fetuses in the womb. As a result, when the fetus was born and grew into manhood, it then began to taking revenge against women. Now tell me which is more important for high school graduates, to get high marks in physics, chemistry and a foreign language, or to acquire a high knowledge of the culture of the conception, carrying and raising of a child? I would say the latter is by far the more important, and yet the disciplines which present such knowledge are not even taught in the school curriculum. Hence, there are graduates of schools, colleges, and universities who give birth to children which they have conceived haphazardly. They often reflect on whether to give birth at all, or perhaps an abortion would be better. They may end up giving birth, only what kind of babies are they giving birth to? The kind that not only should not be exposed to the achievements of physicists and chemists, but should even be kept as far away as possible from knives and sticks. The birth of advanced spiritual thinkers is especially important in this age of scientific and technological progress. It is a tragedy when a maniac like Chikatilo kills and tortures women. It is a blessing that nobody like him is sitting at the controls of nuclear missiles. A blessing, okay, but the caveat must be added for now. The worst will happen if society does not change its attitude toward the culture of giving birth to man. Anastasia continued. With their knowledge of this culture, Radomir and Lubomila effected the transition of their firstborn son from his mother's womb to his new world quite smoothly and painlessly, possibly even joyfully, both for themselves and for the infant. Lubomila had an easy and fear-free birth, and a cheerful one too. When the baby came, she let out not a cry of pain, but a cry of joy, of welcome. She herself drew him out of the water and embraced him. When Radomir washed Lubomila with pure water and then dried her off, he felt like kissing every corner of her body. He even wanted to get down on his knees before her, and he knelt beside the bed as his smiling Lubomila lay under the sheet with her newborn son. As he stood there on his knees, he said softly and penetratingly, "Thank you, Lubomila. You have co-created a child. You are a goddess. You can make dreams come true." "We have co-created a child, Radomir," Lubomila responded with a smile. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18. Not Radomir's last battle. Many happy years went by. By now, their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren were living in domains of their own. But Radomir and Lubomila's love was as strong as ever. Even though their hair had gone grey, they grew happier with each passing year. Radomir stood alone at the entrance to his domain. He looked at the road which led toward a little hillock and disappeared behind it. It was along this road that his sons and grandsons had headed off to battle 2 days ago. Even his teenage grandsons had gone. The enemy that lay ahead of them was most unusual. A prince had brought some sort of people from a foreign country who were all dressed in black and for some reason called themselves monks. In each settlement they visited, they declared that the entire populace had not been living a proper way of life, that their ancient beliefs and rites needed to be eradicated, and that they should bow down to a different god. The prince himself bowed down to it, as did his entourage and armed garrison. No sooner had the prince adopted a different faith than the men in black proclaimed his authority as coming from God. Along with the men in black came soldiers dressed like those in the prince's garrison. They attacked each settlement in turn, demanding that everybody think differently about what they called God. When they found people unwilling to bow down to the foreign god, they killed them with the sword and burnt their houses and orchards. The tribal elders held a council to decide what to do. They called the monks and the prince before the council, but these only spoke to them of the higher good their new god would bring, thereby misleading them with a doctrine nobody could make head nor tail of. The elders were encountering a phenomenon they had never seen before. Whenever an out-and-out enemy had attacked the settlement before, men from all the families quickly formed a militia and collaborated in driving the foe from the land. But here were monks carrying on about love and meekness, about blessings and the marvellous life in paradise awaiting anyone who submitted themselves to the new faith. What the elders did not at first understand was that hiding behind the shield of these beautiful words was an entity which had definitely not been sent to them by God. The god of the Vedras people used no swords. The monks, on the other hand, were backed up by aggressive armed garrisons. Residents in some of the communities headed off to the woods while others joined battle. Some immersed themselves in deep contemplation. That day at dawn, Radomir witnessed the departure of his grandsons from his own domain, and his sons from neighbouring domains. They met at Radomir's domain early in the morning, as though they had planned it among themselves the night before. Of course they planned this, Radomir decided. After all, just the night before, his and Lubamila's eldest son had said, "Tomorrow we're heading out for some war games. We shall learn how to keep enemies from invading our lands." They departed, but still had not returned by the next day's sunset, and old Radomir kept watching the road. Before long, a lone horseman emerged from behind the hillock, heading toward Radomir's domain at full gallop. On the spirited steed, another grey-haired Ulster, not unlike Radomir himself, sat skillfully in the saddle. Squinting his eyes, Radomir recognised his old childhood friend Arga. The grey-haired horseman climbed down from his steed with a groan and quickly began questioning Radomir. "Who's left your domain? Only talk fast." "Lubamila's working on supper, and our youngest grandson is after her with questions," Radomir calmly replied, adding, "It's strange, Arga, how you started asking me a question right off without even saying hello." "No time, I'm in a hurry. Get 2 horses right away, bring along Lubamila and provisions for 3 days, and bring your great-grandson with you, and come with me immediately." "Where to?" "To the woods, to the Drevlians. There's one family there I know fairly well that will give us shelter. No foe will find us there in the dense forest. Perhaps the people will come to their senses as time goes by. Save your great-grandson, Radomir, and you'll save your family line." "And here I thought you'd galloped over to help me, Arga. I see 2 Vedras swords tied to your saddle. What do you need them for if you're planning to hide out from our enemies tonight in some place in the woods?" "The swords are just in case. I'm not about to fight anyone. Besides, there's a whole horde of them. We'd be utterly routed. What's the point of dying thoughtlessly like that?" "Yes, I know, Arga. You never fought with anyone. You never even tried to join in any of the manly games at Maslenitsa time." "That's beside the point. You and I both know, Radomir, that man's life may be eternal, but his soul may be reincarnated in turn in an earthly form. But for that to happen, man must not reflect on death as death approaches, but instead direct his thought toward a marvellous future. Where his thought is to be found, there will man be regenerated anew." "I know all that, Arga. You and I were both taught together by the wise men. Then you ought to recall, Radomir, that you can fall and be fatally wounded in battle and be deprived of the opportunity to think about your reincarnation." "I remember, but again, Arga, I cannot leave my family domain. It is alive, and it won't understand if its friend and master suddenly betrays with disdain the space which has given him its love and abandons it to be torn apart by an enemy. It is alive, and it won't understand. You've always been over-sentimental, Radomir, and you still are today. Well then, stay if you like. Go ahead and stay. Arga paced quickly back and forth, gave his horse's mane a bit of a tussle, and again came over to Radomir. The two grey-haired oldsters stood facing each other without a word. Nobody can ever say what made their hearts beat back then. Perhaps each was immersed in a whole range of thoughts of his own. Once more it was Arga who was the first to break the silence, as he began entreating with noticeable agitation. Stay, if that's what you've decided, Radomir, but do give me Luba Miller and your great-grandson and one of your steeds. At least let them depart and save themselves. Save yourself if you like, if you're unwilling to part from your living space. Radomir gazed at his friend and replied, You can ask Luba Miller about that yourself, Arga. I know you've loved her all your life. That was why you could never marry any other girl and set up your own family domain. Who? Me? I loved her. That's utter nonsense, Arga exclaimed, as all at once he started pacing again, as though trying to persuade himself of the truth of his claim. I'm an artist, and all my life my aim has always been to draw designs and carve small statues. What would I need a wife for? I'm your friend, and my intent was to help you save and extend your family line. As for Luba Miller, I'd quite forgot about her. You are an artist, Arga, and a great one, and an ace of a woodcarver, the best around. Your little statues grace many of the houses in these settlements. And doesn't everybody concur that all the women you draw have a face resembling Luba Miller's? Your carvings, too, look like her. Look like her? So what of it? It's just that I've tried to perfect a certain type of face in my pictures. You've taken pains to hide your love all your life, Arga, Radomir maintained, and now you're hiding it again. I was at the pine tree, which remains all by itself at the edge of the forest. I know you often like to sit beneath it and carve your little statues. I recently came upon your hiding place there, where you stowed away your latest unfinished work, the one that shows a beautiful maiden taming a hot-tempered steed. That is something only Luba Miller could do, as is known to both of us, me and you. I didn't love, I carved, I drew. That's beside the point. It's not what we're about now. Do try to understand. Then after a brief pause, Arga exclaimed, almost shouting, Radomir! Radomir! All your sons have been slain in battle, and all your grandsons too. Radomir maintained his outward calm, looked at Arga, but refrained from speaking. Save yourself, Arga continued to exclaim. I saw them before the battle. I tried to dissuade them from joining such an uneven fray. Your eldest son, your firstborn, he's made just like you, an exact copy, in fact. Stop beating around the bush, Arga, Radomir entreated his childhood friend, though showing no outward signs of concern. Tell me, what did my eldest son say? He said, We'll join the fray. We'll manage to hold off those black monks, at least for an hour or two. I asked your son, why should you die in strife? What good are those couple of hours to you? Our whole family decided this in a council meeting, your eldest son replied. He said, may our parents, Radomir and Luba Miller, enjoy at least 2 more hours of a happy life. Even though they were greatly outnumbered by the black monks and their soldiers, your sons, along with some children from the next settlements away, managed to stave them off for a whole day. Eventually, the monks slayed the children, hacking them to pieces, then went back to their lair again. Tomorrow morning, they'll start heading for your domain. Radomir listened to his friend, but gave no response. Arga continued agitatedly. I galloped over here to help you save your family line. You and I both know that reincarnation on the earth is possible, but this way there will be a finer chance of being reincarnated in a body of a family member. Only your great-grandson this time is capable of extending the family line. Let me have Luba Miller and your great-grandson. I'll help. All of a sudden, Argar stumbled in his speech and paused. He began to peek past Radomir. Radomir turned and looked. Behind him, resting against a tree, stood Luba Miller. Tears were rolling down her cheeks. A trembling hand was clasped to her breast. "Do you hear what Argar said?" Radomir asked Luba Miller. "Yes, I heard," she replied with a trembling voice. "So why are you crying, Luba Miller?" Radomir went over to her and began stroking her hair and kissing her hand. "Our children have surrendered their lives so that we can thrive one more day here in gladness. It's not right for us to spend it in sadness." "No, it is not," smiled Luba Miller through her tears. "You are bright, my dear wife. You have gained the wisdom of the wise men more mightily than anyone else. Think about how best the remainder of the day, the night, and the morning should be spent. I think, so as to do right by the children, we should enter into our space of love. Our grandson is there, in need. It is time to feed him." And taking each other's hand, they headed for the entrance to their family domain. Argar climbed into the saddle and cried out as they walked off, "You're both mindless, sentimental old fools. You ought to save yourselves. You're not in a position to fight with anyone. If you're wounded, it's possible you might not succeed in sending a thought out into space about your reincarnation. I'm getting out of here. I'm going to save myself. I recommend you do the same." At the entrance to the domain, Radomir turned around and responded to his old friend. "Save yourself, Argar. Gallop off to your hiding place in the forest. We are tracing a different path to salvation." Argar spurred on his steed, which rode on its hind legs, and galloped off to the forest at full speed. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19. From the stars will they return to the earth. As they were walking toward the house, where their great-grandson Nicodeme was waiting for them, Luba Miller said, "I think, Radomir, that we should now begin a brand new game with our little great-grandson, the game of life." "What kind of game is that?" Radomir asked in surprise. "I've never heard of it." "I've never played it either, but I learnt about it back in my childhood, when I happened to overhear two old wise men talking with each other. The gist of the game is this. One person plays out all the different stages of life with the child, while the other recalls in detail, as fast as he can, everything he has known in his lifetime, and imparts his knowledge mentally to the child. And if the thought of the narrator is clear, the child memorises the story through his subconscious, and when he grows up, he finds all sorts of hints about life within himself. Who do you think should lead the playing with our great-grandson, Luba Miller?" "You do that, Radomir, while I tell him the story through my thought." "But how will you be able to impart to him all the wisdom of life in just 1 hour? After all, it'll be time to put Nicodeme to bed in an hour from now." "I shall manage. You just start the game and mark off the different stages of life with a clap of your hands." 4-year-old Nicodeme ran to meet them, his arms open wide. Radomir caught him and gave him a toss in the air. Then he set him back down on the ground and began to say, "I recently heard tell of an interesting game. Would you like to play it?" "I would," answered Nicodeme. "But how is it played?" "I shall name something from life in words, and you tell us what it's about without words, using actions and gestures. And grandmother will watch you act it out." "Terrific!" exclaimed Nicodeme as he started jumping for joy on the spot. "Let's start playing it right away." "Okay, let's begin," said Radomir, clapping his hands. And he went on. "Once upon a time, there was born into the world a little boy named Nicodeme. He was just a wee little baby back then. The boy at once lay down on the ground, flung out his hands, and bent his little legs at the knees. Wah! Wah! He bawled, imitating a baby. Radomir clapped his hands and continued. In time, the baby began to get up on his little feet and walk, whereupon Nicodeme at once got up on his feet and took a step as though it were his first, staggered a bit, and then dropped down to all fours. He crawled along for a metre or so and then got up again. But this time he was already walking steadily. Another clap, and Radomir went on. The little one's interest connected with everything. He inspected the bugs and the grass and tried to detect how apples grew on trees. He reflected on why the sun came up and why he felt so warmly affected by everything, both in summertime and when winter came. Little Nicodeme bent over to inspect a bug creeping on over the grass. He looked up at the sky and jumped for joy, then all at once ran over to his grandfather, put his arms around the old man's legs, and then dashed over to his grandmother, who was sitting on the grass. Clasped her around the neck, he pressed his cheek against hers and gave her a kiss. Radomir again clapped his hands and said, "One day it happened that all the people left their domains. They did not travel along the roads where they were going was not heard. Perhaps they flew away like the birds on the way to the stars. Then into the domain, where the little one had been left alone, came a foe who burns houses and hacks down orchards with an axe." Little Nicodeme listened to his great-grandfather's frightening tale. This time he stood motionless without attempting actions or gestures, and finally said, "I don't like this game. That should never happen in life." "Yes, in life it shouldn't, you are right," Radomir replied to his great-grandson, "but this is a game after all." "Well, I shan't play it." The boy stamped his little feet and cried out, "I shan't." "I'll take over," declared Lubomila, getting up from the ground. When the little one caught sight of the foe, he called over the bear that he had played with when still just a wee mite. He took hold of the nape of the bear's neck, just as he had always done. He grasped hold of the bear's fur with all his might, and the bear lumbered off with him into the woods. With these words, Lubomila called out in the direction of a little grove of trees where their household animals lived. "Hey there, brown bear! Come over to me! Come on, as quick as can be!" Out from the grove emerged the bear and bounded over to Lubomila. When he came up beside her, she began stroking its muzzle. Then she whispered something in its ear. She tousled the fur on its shoulder, then, grasping hold of it with her hands, sprang onto its back. "Hey, giddy up!" she called to the bear. The bear ran around in a wheel formation with all his might until halted by Lubomila. "But why would our great-grandson go off to the forest on a bear and not a horse?" asked Radomir, and Lubomila replied, "Of course, a steed could go faster than a bear over the fields, but a horse would be helpless indeed in the woods, while the bear will find food and shelter there. Besides, in the woods, the bear will offer the best protection. So there's your answer. Let's go on with the game." So the bear ran off into the forest and hid the child there from the foe. He took care of him until the boy grew up to be a man. When he had grown, one day the young lad caught sight of a girl in the forest who had come to pick berries in the glade. They liked each other right off and later got married. They found a spot on the ground which would be hidden from malevolent eyes. They built a domain and began to bear children, and all their relatives, who had flown off to the stars long ago, came back to the earth. As he drifted off to sleep, little Nicodeme thought about the game, but he did not find it entertaining. During this time, Lubomila and Radomir walked about their family domain and recalled the life they had lived there. It had been a thoroughly joyful experience. Lubomila laughed like a child when Radomir tried to portray her as a little girl standing amidst the tall grass. "Do you recall? You remember how you called out back then that I was a good-for-nothing because I had raised the hem of your dress? I dried your tears with your dress, and you talked about being dishonoured." "Yes, I remember it all," his wife responded, laughing. "But I thought of something just now. You could have dried my tears with the edge of your shirt." "I was a smart boy, I was. I decided, why soil and mess my shirt when I was going to have to wash out your dress in any case?" "Yes, you were a smart boy. But still, you did lift up the hem of my dress, you good-for-nothing." Oh, look at our spot, the wedding mound. New flowers have come up. And look how tall and majestic the cedar has grown. It was so small when we planted it on our wedding day. Luba Miller pressed the palm of her hand to the trunk and rested her cheek against it. She stood there without saying a word. Radomir, as love-struck as ever, put his arms around her shoulders as before and said, "Where shall we sleep tonight? Here or in the house? Wherever you say, my darling." The next morning a detachment of 50 soldiers entered the domain. With them were 2 monks dressed in black. The soldiers saw an old man standing by the cedar, and an old woman beside him, her back pressed against his. Each of them held 2 swords in their hands. "You see," the elder monk called out to the soldiers. "You see the infidels standing there? These infidels have borne children. Don't use your arrows. Hack them to pieces with your swords." 2 warriors approached the elderly couple from different sides, their swords raised. They tried to land a blow, but Radomir managed to turn back the foe and disarm one of the warriors with his sword, and Luba Miller warded off the attack against her. Then the old people repelled a second attack, then a third. After that the soldiers began fighting with each of them by twos, but Radomir had 2 swords in his hands, which flashed like lightning. He warded off both attacks simultaneously, but did not shed the soldiers' blood. The grey-haired Luba Miller laughed as she too repelled both attacks on her. "Everyone step back," shouted the elder monk. "They are being helped by an unclean force. Everyone step back. Everybody shoot at them with your bows." Those wielding the swords retreated. Others prepared their bows, but as soon as they had reached for their bowstrings, the old couple threw down the swords, turned to each other and embraced. Radomir whispered something to Luba Miller, and she smiled in response. "What are you waiting for? Shoot!" shrieked the monk. "They are infidels. You have been God. Shoot or I'll curse you." 1 arrow went into Luba Miller and 2 into Radomir. But as though they did not feel any pain, the old couple still stood there and before. The arrows flew, the ground was covered in blood. Luba Miller and Radomir slowly sank down, or perhaps they flew off to the stars. Their bodies lay on the ground. The elder monk, the priest's emissary, looked into them to himself. They were not thinking about death as death approached. Their thoughts were of... Their faces showed no fear nor sorrow. What must be done to prevent it again? He stood there in fear, feverishly trying to come up. All at once, behind his back, rose a murmur of agitation. The monk turned around and saw 6 soldiers lying dead on the ground beneath the apple tree. Each of their hands was clutching an apple core. The monk knew right away what had happened. The high priest's emissary knew that the Vedras orchards produced marvellous fruit, but it could only be eaten when the garden's owner gave it of his own free will. The Vedras people treated their trees and flowers as living beings, which repaid them with their love. When the trees and flowers saw how strangers acted toward the people who had bestowed their love upon them, the apple tree called up other juices from the depths of its roots and infested its fruits with an extremely strong poison. "Don't touch it! Don't eat anything here!" cried the monk. "I told you this is a devil's tribe, and the place here is unclean. I command you in the name of the Almighty to cut down everything, for everything here." "Look!" yelled one of the soldiers. "Look over there!" waving his hand in the direction of the entrance to the domain. Everybody turned to see a bear heading out of the domain by leaps and bounds. On top of it, clinging on to its fur, rode a little boy. The bear rushed out of the domain and made a headlong dash for the woods. "After them! Go get them!" shrieked the monk. "Don't come back until you have hacked the little vermin to pieces." He knew that if even one of the Vedras people escaped, their whole line could be regenerated on the earth. But he did not tell this to the soldiers. To them he simply kept referring to the will of God. "Go get 'em! God commands you to root out everything unclean from the earth. You see how unclean it is here?" The detachment's commander ordered a dozen soldiers to follow the bear, catch up to it, and kill the boy. The soldiers jumped on their steeds and headed out after the bear at a gallop. In the meantime, the bear was bounding quickly toward the forest, but it could not keep up such a feverish pace for long, and the pursuers, galloping as they were at full speed, were gradually catching up. The distance between the bear and the horseman slowly but surely narrowed. They were only about 100 metres from the forest when one of the pursuers caught up. Racing alongside, he raised his sword to kill the child. But the bear suddenly rose on its hind paws and took the blow on itself. The horse, with the rider, struck out to one side and reared. In the meantime, the wounded bear continued streaking toward the forest. Now it had a mere 50 metres to go. But by this time the detachment of horsemen had almost caught up, swords in their hands at the ready. But then, all at once, the soldiers noticed another horseman, this one all on his own, heading out from the woods directly toward them. An old man was sitting with ease in the saddle, his grey hair and beard waving in the breeze. Each of his hands brandished a sword, while he controlled his steed with his legs gone. "Giddy up! Giddy up!" the old man called, and spurred on his horse, which was already moving at an incredible gallop. "He's ready to fight us! Make ready for battle with this crazy old man," the detachment commander shouted to the rest. "But he's all alone and there's 10 of us," a warrior protested. "He's just an old man. What's there to be afraid of? We need to get on with the chase." "Yes, he's alone, but he's a Vedrus. Make ready for battle, whoever's not a timid goose." The elderly attacker on his steed galloped around the detachment of horsemen. With his swords, he managed to disarm the 2 outer warriors and cut the saddle girth from 2 of the horses, at which point his own extraordinary steed was wounded by an arrow. But the old fellow did not direct his wounded steed toward the forest, but galloped around the edge of the woods, causing the whole detachment to pursue this course as well. When they got to the lone pine tree at the edge of the forest, his horse stumbled and the rider fell. The old man jumped up from the ground and started running toward the pine. He was looking for something in the grass at the time the detachment caught up with him. The pine tree took several arrows in its chest, but the 8th pierced Arga's breast. The thrown Vedrus rider lay on the ground but did not moan. A stream of blood flowed from his chest. The pine tree, being wooden, could not lament the wound, while Arga's thought rose to the heavens in a state of doom. I don't ask for myself any reincarnation, but I give them my thought for their future creation, to add to their joy and their great inspiration. Get together, reincarnate, and live without end. Radomir, Lubomila, I'm no foe, but your friend. The Vedrus lay there on the ground, but did not utter a sound. Even in his weakened state, he was still able to press a little statue of his beloved to his breast. "Good shall prevail," he whispered to his beloved, almost in a wail. And the pine tree wept. The wooden pine tree wept. A rather strange-looking pitch began showing itself, flowing down its trunk. All at once the Vedrus opened his eyes, and his vision was clear, and barely able to enunciate the words, he blurted out, "Don't be sad, little pine tree, it's all nonsense here. My thought will break through these bad times of barbarity. Once more there will flourish bright ages of clarity. To all earthly goddesses the morn will give hail, and my thought will imply to them, good shall prevail." Soldiers on their steeds did not succeed in catching up to the boy on the bear. They tried to penetrate the forest, but the forest did not turn out to be a friendly place for them. Their steeds began snorting in fear, and no clear path under their feet remained. The soldiers returned and explained to the monk that the boy had been slain. A few years went by, and people began to say that while they were mushroom picking in the woods, they caught sight of a boy of about 10 or older. He would peer at them from the bushes, but seem afraid to come near. And there was always an old lame bear with him. Some time later, 2 young boys got lost in the forest and became frightened. A youth came toward them and gestured them to follow him. He led them to the edge of the woods, right to the road which led to their settlement, while he himself retreated once more into the forest hiding place. After this incident, people stopped being afraid of the forest youth. And when a year later he headed out of the woods one day toward a group of young lasses gathering berries in the glade, the girls were not afraid of him and did not run away. The youth was blue-eyed and of slender build. He was dressed in clothing woven from grasses. He stood at the edge of the glade. One lass in particular caught his eye, whose name was Prascovia. In truth, he could not take his eyes off her, and everyone suddenly stopped picking berries and stared at the youth. Then very slowly, so as not to frighten them, he took several steps toward the group of girls and stopped. Seeing that the maidens were not running away and were not afraid of him, he approached young Prascovia, stood facing her, smoothed out his hair, and blurted out, though not without some stumbling, "Together with you, my fair maiden, I could create a space of love to last forever." Prascovia had absolutely no idea as to what these words meant, but for some reason her cheeks flushed with a rosy glow and she began to talk with the young lad. "Where do you live?" she asked. "Everybody says you live in the forest, all on your own." "For the time being I live on the earth alone," replied the youth. "Alone? But where are your parents then?" "No one exists without some kind of family. They are living, my father and mother and elder brothers and my sisters and my grandfather Radomir and my grandmother Lubomila." "And where do they dwell? In the forest as well?" "They are flown way up high to the stars in the sky. They will come back down to the earth from afar when I have found my intended. I shall create and form a space of love all around, and this is where our children will be born." "But how will you look for your intended in the forest?" "I shall not need to look, she has already been found." "And who is she?" "You, my maiden, you are the most splendid of all. I ask you now to come with me to my space, which I have already begun to create. I shall build a house, but there are just a few tools I need to get. Not having them yet, I have constructed a shelter in the meantime. I've been observing from afar how it is done." The maidens whispered among themselves and made fun of the youth. By this time they had become quite unafraid. Prascovia did not answer his proposal right away, but withdrew to her group of maidens. The young man stood a little apart, looked to the sky, and opened his arms wide as though apologizing to someone, then slowly turned and headed away from the glade. A hush fell over the maidens. Prascovia watched him depart, and then all at once called out loudly and confidently to the youth, "Wait for me here tomorrow. I'll steal the tools you need from my father as a dowry." The youth quickly turned around and ran over to Prascovia. The maidens saw him smile for the first time, and all their cheeks flushed with a rosy glow. The young man's smile was extraordinary, and his eyes were beaming all the while. "How handsome he is! Too bad he didn't pick me," whispered one of the girls. "I'm ready to go with him too," another announced all of a sudden. In the meantime, the young man said to Prascovia, not seeing anyone around, "You mustn't steal. That is not a kind deed." "I was only joking. My father will be glad to give me anything I need." From that point on, nobody ever again laid eyes on the pair. They saw neither the forest youth nor the maiden Prascovia, who had gone off with him to goodness knows where. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20. Even in chaos there is a purpose. Life continued on the earth, Anastasia went on, but it was not the same life as before. The great Vedrus civilization, its traditions, rites, and culture, which had existed for tens of thousands of years, were replaced by a chaotic, barbarian order of human society. In our state, the period of slavery began with Kievan Rus and continues to the present day. But wasn't the Vedrus civilization destroyed even earlier in other territories of the earth? I remember you saying, Anastasia, that the Vedrus way of life was prevalent among the inhabitants of what is now Germany, England, Poland, and the Baltic countries. Yes, I did say that. It was all one people, one language, one culture. If you look closely, Vladimir, you will see that they all resemble each other even in outward appearance. This, despite the fact that for more than 2 millennia there was a good deal of blood mixing between them and Asian peoples. But why did things come about like that, Anastasia? You said it was a great civilization and a great culture. Yet, in the blink of an eye, this civilization was destroyed by the sword, fire, and arrows. Not destroyed, Vladimir. That word is not really appropriate. As long as there are at least 9 people on the planet who are striving for a conscious awareness of the divine earthly being, the Vedras civilization is alive. But now, after all, there are not just 9 people, but hundreds of thousands who are discovering more and more the truth within themselves and are changing their way of life at the core. They will soon number in the millions, but for now these hundreds of thousands should be seeking for the answer to the puzzle within themselves, for an understanding of how the disaster came about. But what if they don't understand? On our internet site there's a whole lot of people who've been trying for several years now to determine what specific mistake mankind permitted to slip through in the age of the image. There's a discussion forum there known as the mistake of the age of the image. But so far, nobody's managed to make out what that mistake might be. There's a lot of variance, but no overall answer here. It might not come for another 1,000 years. Maybe nobody will ever be able to determine the mistake. They will, perhaps in a day, or perhaps in 5 to 9 years. They will find the answer. How can you be so sure? Think about it, Vladimir. It was only a short time ago that people did not even talk about the subject at all. And there were not even any attempts to think along these lines. Now you tell me yourself that a whole lot of people are endeavouring to solve the mystery. Thought is switched on, just like a little shoot from a seed. It will find its way to the light. It will find it someday, perhaps. People today are mainly involved in the routine of their everyday life. Your grandfathers and you have had the opportunity to do a lot more reflecting. Besides, you have access to a huge amount of information about the past. And then, naturally, you have your own view of things. Why not share it? At least give people a hint. In other words, Vladimir, you're asking me to switch people's thinking off? Now, why would I be the one who wants to switch it off? Why would a simple hint have that kind of result? If everybody who is trying to work out the solution today in their thought gives the hint as gospel truth, their thinking will immediately cease operations. Then they'll be expecting even more hints, and you may be sure that the hints will come. In fact, they'll quickly pour down in showers upon them. That is precisely what is happening right now. People are getting hints right and left about what is healthy to eat and drink, how to dress, where the best resorts are, how to live, and where to search for God. And what is the result? Life progressively gets worse. God created the order of the universe with his thought, and he gave thought as a gift to man. But somebody is constantly trying to bring it to a halt. Does that mean you know the answer, but you don't want to talk about it? I do not know the answer, but I can presuppose. Well, what presuppositions have you come up with? For example, pray tell. Perhaps a period of chaos was needed, a period of mistakes, so that mankind might have a complete account of it and not repeat it in the future. Similar phenomena have emerged in history when mankind is on the verge of a great discovery, a discovery of universal proportions. Now that, Anastasia, is what I call a good and encouraging presupposition. Your story about the Vedras family, Lubomila and Radomir, had a very sad ending, quite unlike your usual optimism. Vladimir, why have you decided that the story has come to an end? life continues, and so not a single story about life can ever be considered to have come to an end. I remember how the great-grandson Nicodeme went off with Prascovia and continued the family line, but I still feel sorry for specific individuals like Radomir, Lubomila and the others. The story about them cannot be continued. One can talk only about continuing the family line. If there's something more you can tell me, then please do tell me, Anastasia. Fine. I shall tell about events that took place in the very near future. End of chapter 20.